Assalamualaikum and greeting to everyone. My name is Hana Najah binti Abdurrasik and I will be the first one to present. In this video, my guru will explain and discuss about Industry Code of Practice on Chemicals Classification and Hazard Communication 2014. We will talk about the introduction, classification method, chemical classification, hazard communication labeling and SDS, confidential business information, and lastly, conclusion. Okay, firstly, introduction. Industrial Code of Practice or ICOP is promulgated under Section 37 of the Occupational Safety and Health Act 1994 as a guidance to chemical suppliers to comply with the Prevention of Occupational Safety and Health Classification, Labeling and Safety Data Sheet of Hazardous Chemicals Regulation 2013, which have been gazetted on 11 October 2013, hereinafter is referred to as the regulations. The regulation is to replace Occupational Safety and Health Classification, Packaging and Labeling of Hazardous Chemicals Regulation 1997. The implementation of the regulations is consistent with Malaysia's commitment in implementing of the globally harmonized system for classification and labeling of chemicals (GHS) for industrial workplace sector, especially in supplying chemicals for use at work in Malaysia. Besides, the objective of this is to provide the guidelines for the compliance of the requirement of the regulations. Next, ICOP consists of 4 parts, which is Part 1, List of Classified Chemicals, Part 2, Chemicals Classification, Part 3, Hazard Communication Labeling and Safety Data Sheet, and lastly, Part 4, Confidential Business Information. How to classify dangerous chemicals based on Industrial Code of Practice. Basically, classified chemicals are based on 3 things. That is Hazard Statement Code or H code, Hazard Pictogram, and lastly, Signer word. A hazard statement code or H code is a statement assigned to a hazard class and category that describes the nature of the hazards of the hazardous chemicals, including where appropriate the degree of hazards. Meanwhile, hazard pictogram is a labeling of hazardous chemicals, which means a graphical composition conveying a specific information on the hazard concerned. Lastly, signer word is a word used to indicate the relative level of severity of hazard and alert the reader to a potential hazard on the label. This is the example of classification method including H code, hazard pictogram, and signer word as mentioned before. Part 1 of ICOP contains a list of chemical substances that have been classified by DOSH. For hazardous substance on the list, company must use the classifications given on the list. For substance not on the list, companies shall use classification criteria given in Part 2 to classify their chemicals.
Chemical classification is separated into the 3 parts. First is physical hazard, health hazard, and also environment hazard. Okay, for physical hazard, it class based on physicochemical properties and also chemical structure. For physical chemical properties, it depends on the state of the substance, which is gas, liquid, or solid. While for chemical structure, when liquid and solid contain specific chemical group in their molecules. So this is how we select of the assessment item according to the chemical structure. First, if the chemical group relate to explosive, we test it as explosive and self-reactive. Second, if the chemical contain chemical group relate to explosive as well as do relate to self-reactive, we test it as self-reactive chemical. And next, if the chemical contain oxygen, fluorine or chlorine, and if any of these elements are bound to the element other than carbon and hydrogen, we test it as oxidized liquid and oxidized solid, and so on. So, this is how we classification of physical hazard based on physical and chemical state and also chemical structure. Okay, next, this is the type of physical hazard. Classification chemical for health hazard and environment hazard contain this following data. First is criteria of classification chemical. Second is decision logic. Third is hazard communication element. Is 11 type of health hazard. The environment hazard is divided into 3 parts. First is hazardous to aquatic environment, acute and also chronic, and lastly is hazardous to ozone layer.
Hi, I'm Siti Asha, and now I would like to share about hazard communication, labeling and safety datasheet SDS. Firstly, let me give some introduction. Hazard communication means the communication of hazard information to the users of chemicals of labeling safety datasheet SDS and training. However, this ICOP will only address requirements pertaining to labeling and SDS. So how about SDS? SDS is an up-to-date handout or information sheet containing relevant information pertaining to the hazardous chemicals, which is vital for established arrangement in the safe use of chemicals at work. While for labeling, it is containing 2 types, which is GHS label and GHS pictograms. But before that, GHS is the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemical. Let's see the GHS label. Under Sub-Regulation 8.1 of the regulation, the supplier is required to label every packaging of hazardous chemical legibly and indelibly containing the following information, which is product identifier, UN number, UN transport pictogram, first aid, hazard statement, supplier identification, precautionary statement, GHS pictogram, and signal word. Let's see the example. Here is the example of GHS label that contains all the information that I mentioned before. Here we can see the label of product identifier that used on the label should match with the product identifier used in the SDS. The signal word used in the regulation are danger and warning. Danger is used for more severe hazard categories, while warning is used for the less severe. Only one signal should appear on the label. The hazard statement describes the nature of the hazard of hazardous chemical, including where appropriate the degree of hazard as specified in first schedule of the regulation. The precautionary statement describes the recommended measure that should be taken to minimize or prevent adverse effect resulting from exposure to hazardous chemicals. For supplier identification, must include the name, address and telephone number of the supplier of the hazardous chemical should be provided on the label. All hazard pictogram used in the label should be in diamond shape with the side title at 45 degrees to the horizontal. Let's move to the GHS pictogram. The hazard pictogram consists of a symbol and a border. The hazard pictogram should have a black symbol on a white background with a red border, sufficiently white to be clearly visible. Here is the symbol. We have oxidizer, flammable, explosive, acetylide, toxic, burn skin, gases under pressure, carcinogen, toxic to aquatic environment, acetylide, toxic that can irritant to skin, eyes or respiratory tract, etc. Safety data sheet SDS is to create awareness among users of hazardous chemicals of the consequence of failure to comply with the recommendation and to make users of hazardous chemicals understand safety recommendation and the rationale for this recommendation. The SDS should be presented using the following headings in the order given below. Here is 16 section of SDS. Product and company information, hazard identification, composition information on ingredients, first aid measures, firefighting measures, accidental release, handling and storage, exposure controls, personnel protection, physical, chemical properties, stability and reactivity, toxicology information, ecological information, disposal consideration, transport information, regulatory information, and other information. That's all for me. I will pass to the next presenter.
Thank you, Aisha, for the great explanation for hazard communication labeling and safety data sheet or SDS. Okay, now with me, I'm Hazmi Helmi, metric number 157687. We'll continue our presentation with confidential business intro, or also known as CBI. So what is CBI? General principles for CBI. CBI claims must only list the name of compounds and their amounts in mixtures if additionally information on chemical inventories or SDS is necessary. As necessary, all further information must be disclosed in the inventory and SDS. The inventory or SDS must state where CBI has been withheld, and upon request, CBI must be sent to the Director General of Occupational Safety and Health. According to Section 67 of OSHA 1994, the confidentiality of the information acquired is safeguarded. So next, we move to CBI requirements. If the identity of the dangerous substance is commercially confidential, a generic name may be used to describe it. When an ingredient's precise concentration is CBI, its concentration must be declared using the permitted concentration range below or a smaller range. So there is a global concentration range for ingredients claimed as CBI. As you can see here, there's a table range for ingredients. So, for example, for an ingredient present at 35%, the allowable concentration range is 30 to 60%. However, the narrower range of 30 to 40% can be used. Next, we move to guides for selecting generic names. Basically, this guide describes the procedure for naming hazardous chemicals and the division of substances into families. The families are defined in the following manner. Firstly, inorganic or organic substance whose properties are identified by having a common chemical element as their chief characteristic. The family name is derived from the name of the chemical element. These families are identified by the atomic number of the chemical element. Second, organic substance whose properties are identified by having a common functional group as their chief characteristic. First, the family name is derived from the functional group name, and these families are identified by the number convention. And lastly, for the guides selecting generic names, subfamilies bringing together substance with a common specific character have been added in certain cases. So that's all from me. Now I'm passing back this presentation to Hanan.
In conclusion, this ICOP contains a list of chemical substances that have been classified, guidance on chemical classification, and hazard communication. This ICOP provides guidance to the principal suppliers on self-classification of chemicals according to method and classification criteria of GHS. In addition, this ICOP can assist the suppliers in preparing label and safety data sheets according to the regulations. Lastly, and the most important thing is, this ICOP is a legally blind document to fulfill the requirements under the regulations. That's all the presentation about Industry Code of Practice on Chemical Classification and Hazard Communication 2014 from our group. Thank you for listening and watching.